We hear a lot in the financial press about important technologies. We hear about the Facebook initial public offering, we hear about Google, we hear about Microsoft. But given the performance of Facebook recently, we can start to wonder, what about the unimportant technologies? Maybe sometimes the inventions that don't seem to be momentous actually turn out to be surprisingly profitable and surprisingly worthwhile for society. There was an economist named Hubert Henderson who coined the phrase in the mid-20th century, the importance of being unimportant. And what he meant was this, that there are some activities, some professions, some technologies that are a relatively small part of much larger enterprises. They make a contribution, but the contribution is not very large in a total budget. And this paradoxically means that because they're essential but unimportant, they're much less sensitive to price pressure. And they also offer, in some cases, a lot more opportunity. Henderson gave the example of coal miners and steel smelters. Coal miners are a lot more important for the production of steel and many other things than steel smelters are. You can't do anything unless you have the coal. However, society needs many more coal miners. There's a much bigger budget for coal miners. And as a result, coal miners often have to go on strike, or at least did in England feel they often had to go on strike for wages. Whereas the steel smelters, because they were a relatively small part of the cost of production of steel, usually had an easier time of it. Another great economist, Alfred Marshall, gave some examples in a classic textbook he wrote in the 1890s, Principles of Economics. Marshall looked at the building trades. He looked at the carpenters. The gentleman shown here is not Abraham Lincoln on his way to split rails. He looked at the bricklayers. This comes from an approximately contemporary children's book. And he looked at the plasterers. What he found was that house building depends a lot on bricklayers and carpenters. The plasterers at the time were essential for completing a house, but a relatively small part of the total cost of building a house, which means that the plasterers had a lot more leverage in the same way that steel workers had more leverage. The plasterers in that sense were unimportant, and yet at the time they were essential. Well, there's a twist to the story, as you can imagine, because this privileged position of the plasterers didn't last forever. In fact, at the time Marshall was writing, there was already a patent for what is now called sheetrock. At the end of the Second World War, with the housing boom, it was finally time for sheetrock to come into its own and for the trade of plastering to become one mainly of historical restoration. The great icon of the rise of sheetrock was, of course, Daly City, which was the place that inspired little houses on the hillside, little houses made of ticky-tacky. So the great days of the plasterers were over. But there have been other trades and professions and inventions where unimportance has been of lasting value. One business that especially interested Hubert Henderson was the sewing thread business. Sewing thread really came into its own with the Industrial Revolution, and especially with the invention of the sewing machine in the 1850s. The sewing machine was an important invention. In fact, it was one of the most important in history in the sense that it did more to multiply the productivity of workers than any other innovation I can think of. There was up to a 40-fold increase in the productivity of a sewing machine operator vis-a-vis a hand sewer. That was important, and it made a fortune for the failed actor Isaac Singer, who brought together a group of patent holders to create the sewing machine as we know it. And the sewing machine spread across the world, and it became a very important industry. One American sewing thread company that fascinated the press, you can find quite a few examples of multi-part newspaper articles at the turn of the century, was the American Thread Company. Here is its headquarters in New York City, no longer a corporate office, but still bearing the name, one of the largest buildings of its time in Lower Manhattan. And its factories in Willimantic, Connecticut, were not only famous for photographic views, but were even the subject of paintings. What made this unimportant sewing thread industry so lucrative was the following paradox of unimportance. After the invention of the sewing machine, everything depended on the ability of an operator to sew a garment with as few interruptions as possible. Bargain sewing thread that broke would be very expensive in wages, and therefore premium sewing thread that had a reputation for reliability and strength could be a very profitable business once you were established in it. Sewing thread was a small part of the total cost of a garment, so it didn't cost you very much more to use the very best thread than it did to use cheap thread. And out of this fact, a surprising number of industrial dynasties were born, which in turn produced leading figures in social science, humanities, and the arts. Start with the revolutionary Friedrich Engels, who is shown here with his better-known friend and colleague Karl Marx. Recent scholarship has shown that Engels was not only the author of an excellent book on the condition of the working class in England, but contributed many other ideas to work that's usually ascribed to Karl Marx alone. What was it that financed this activity and that let him finance Karl Marx? It was his family's sewing thread business. The Engels controlled the patent in a superior form of sewing thread called diamond thread. They had factories not only in Germany, but in England. And it was in England that Engels had the opportunity to see factory conditions at first hand and to write about them. Another giant figure who is not conventionally linked to the thread industry was Lord Kenneth Clark, whose series on civilization is now available in HD format on DVD. He was one of the greatest, or at least one of the most popular art historians of the 20th century. What was it that financed his studies? It was the fact that his grandfather, Patrick Clark, a weaver's supplier in Paisley, Scotland, had the idea of selling cotton thread on wooden spools. And thanks to the company that Patrick Clark founded, Kenneth Clark was able to grow up in a home near Glasgow with a 9-hole golf course and resident pro. He later wrote of his parents that they were not the richest of the idle rich, but they were surely the idlest. And all of this because of the grandfather's invention. The Clark firm merged late in the 19th century with another great Paisley firm, Coates. Together, these companies were called the Threadocracy. They were notorious in their time. And Coates and Clark in 1900 was the largest manufacturing company in the United Kingdom. One of their factories still stands and is still one of the largest buildings of its kind in the United Kingdom. Production has long moved out of Europe. It's now almost entirely in Asia. However, the company still exists and is still highly profitable. Henri Cartier-Bresson was one of the greatest photographers of the 20th century, but connoisseurs of fashion know another side of Cartier-Bresson, which was that his family manufactured a thread called cross-brand thread, which was one of the most prestigious in Europe and which was favored by all of the couture houses. You can still find some products of the Cartier-Bresson factory on eBay today. Of course, there were lots of other people from wealthy families who never achieved anything, so I am not claiming that the thread industry was responsible for Cartier-Bresson's success. But the fact was that this was a business that was profitable enough that other people could manage it, and that Henri Cartier-Bresson would have the leisure to pursue his artistic gifts. Finally, many Americans love the novels of the late writer Louis Auchincloss, shown here receiving the National Humanities Medal from President and Mrs. George W. Bush. What's less known about Mr. Auchincloss was that his family was very prominent in thread importing in the United States and was allied for a time with the Coates family. So Mr. Auchincloss, too, might be considered a member of the threadocracy. There was great unimportant invention, not just in Western Europe and the United States, but in Central Europe too, and especially in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's a growing interest in the work of the novelist Italo Svevo, who was based in Trieste, Italy. Svevo did not come from a family of inventors or manufacturers, but he married into one. The Veneziani family, to which his wife belonged, had developed a unique marine paint that was ideally suited for preventing the encrustation of ships with barnacles and other marine life. This was a very small part of the cost of building and maintaining a ship. It could be sold profitably, and yet it saved owners a great deal of expense. This yacht, refitted for military use in the First World War, was one of the first ships to be traded with this paint, which received such great reports that it later became the favorite of the great shipping company Austrian Lloyd. You can still see its headquarters in Trieste today. The people we've been talking about so far have been the heirs or in-laws of inventors, but sometimes inventors of great unimportant technologies also establish artistic dynasties. One of them, and one of the most eccentric, was an Austrian named Hans Herberger, who was working in Vienna around the 1890s. Herberger saw a crucial defect in blast furnace design, which was that the bellows that were pumping the air were very easily worn out. He devised a new metal valve that was ideally suited for saving money in steel production. You can see the US patent here. It is very hard to explain the valve, and I won't try to do so, but I can only say that a new version of it is still being marketed by the same company, which today has over $1 billion of worldwide sales. So the man was obviously onto something. He became a famous unconventional thinker in cosmology. He developed something that he called the cosmic ice theory, which still has some fans today. This is not considered a great contribution to astrophysics or meteorology, but his children and grandchildren did become very notable in their own fields. His son, Paul Herberger, especially, was one of the greatest European actors of the period between the wars. This is a picture of him in his younger days, but he's probably best known to the world's filmgoers now as the porter in the 1949 Carol Reed film, The Third Man. He was such a good actor that he was able to speak bilingually in great Viennese English, even though he did not speak a word of English, and was coached syllabically during the film. There are still members of the Herberger family prominent in European theater and film, by the way. Around the time that Hans Herberger was inventing his valve, an American named George Schrader was working on an invention of his own that you probably own, and in fact of which you probably own 6 or 10 or more, and that is the common valve used in automotive and bicycle tires. Schrader's family was in the marine supply business. They built diving helmets and suits and equipment like that, which had valves of their own. So when the bicycle in its present form was born in the 1890s with pneumatic tires, they were very well positioned to adapt their valves to the new technology. They prospered when bicycling became the institution it remains today, and they prospered even more when the automobile joined the bicycle in the world of transportation. George Schrader, by the way, was a noted philanthropist, although this role is largely forgotten. He founded a home for recovering first-time mothers in the Bronx, New York, and he started a series of philanthropies in Iceland, which, for unclear reasons, he adopted as a country for his philanthropic enterprises. One of his great causes was the plight of the Icelandic horse, which he believed was not being treated very well by the native Icelanders. He wrote a book in German on the Icelandic horse, which is still the standard treatment of the subject, and he had it translated into Icelandic. He is still the subject of serious study today in Iceland. He disappeared on a ship during the First World War. This is another side of invention, whether important or unimportant. It's really that the creative person who sees things differently will also see them differently as a philanthropist. Very often we learn about great unimportant inventions only when the inventor or entrepreneur becomes the subject of news unrelated to the device itself. During the Watergate era, the name Robert Abplanalp often appeared in the news as a friend of President Richard Nixon. Some of the stories noted that Mr. Abplanalp was an inventor, and the actual facts are even more striking. His invention was the valve that is most commonly used in aerosol cans. He received a very, very small royalty on every can of aerosol product that was made in the United States, or on the great majority. And this was what allowed him to befriend Richard Nixon. Now, we might not really see the legacy of the spray can as a great cultural accomplishment, but there are some people who believe that it has helped them in their own artistic endeavors. It might be paradoxical to talk about an unimportant invention that became part of some of the most visible and important objects in the world. And yet I think that's the only way to consider the contributions of the German-born engineer John Roebling, who studied with the philosopher Hegel when he was a student in Berlin. As a philosopher, I think he would have appreciated that paradox. Roebling's contribution was to see the possibilities in taking a thin strand of wire and combining it with other strands in rope and other forms that actually made the wire into a new kind of material, gaining strength through numbers. Roebling invented in 1847 a system of spinning cable for bridges that is still in use today. The idea was that a reel of wire would be connected to an anchorage and carried back and forth across the towers of the bridge until there was enough wire to be grouped into bundles and then to be compressed into cables. And that is how great bridges have been built ever since. The first really famous example was the Brooklyn Bridge, but the company continued to grow and continued to develop their concepts. It was the mark of the strength of Roebling that the company was able to resist the consolidation of most of the American steel industry into U.S. Steel and other giant trusts. Roebling stayed independent, and the reason was that nobody was quite as good at this niche as the Roebling company. It did one thing, and one thing very, very well: wire. It specialized in the little things, and the little things made the big things possible. In 2012, the world celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge. This bridge was built with the same principle that Roebling had developed 90 years earlier. The cables have held up magnificently ever since. In San Francisco, there's an exhibition of a cross-section of the cable that shows how all of those thousands of strands of wire were compressed into a cable that still is the largest ever spun. And yet, each of those strands was carried independently over the bridge's span. So the paradox really is that if you add enough little things together, you can get something that is very, very grand indeed. Around the time the Golden Gate Bridge was under construction, there was another American family company that was doing amazing things with the unimportant technology of wire. This is a technology that is as familiar in its own way as the Golden Gate Bridge, and I'm referring to the stapler as we know it, and to Jack and Belle Linsky, the couple who developed the modern stapler. There were staplers before the 1930s. The problem was that it could be quite a challenge to load all of the staples. They came together in a way that required removing a tray from the stapler, very gingerly transferring the loose staples to the stapler, then shutting the stapler and hoping that everything wasn't going to get spilled. The Linskys imported staplers from Germany, and they tried to persuade their German suppliers to modify the equipment, but they had no success, so they decided to develop their own. The Linskys weren't engineers, but they saw the possibilities for hiring engineers to patent technology and assign it to their company. We know very little about the people who actually developed the technology behind staplers. I have tried to research them, and there is almost nothing available biographically, but they were obviously extremely gifted people. The biggest innovation of the Linskys was the so-called cohered staple, and these are the staples that we all know. They come in strips that are glued together. The glue is just strong enough so that when you drive a staple, one staple comes off and the others stay on the strip. This is a simple thing, but it must have taken a great deal of trial and error to arrive at the right formulation of the chemical, and I have read that for a long time, actually, this formula was not patented. Here is the patent document, but the essentials of the chemistry were really kept secret. That was the most closely guarded secret of Swingline, although other companies learned how to do that too. The other great innovation of the Linskys in the 1930s, as represented by the Swingline name, was a stapler that didn't require the removal and reinsertion of a part, but that let you drop in your cohered staples into a slot that opened up when you drew back the top of the stapler. And here is the patent for that. These two innovations together were incremental, and yet they were also profound, because the stapler, as redesigned by Swingline, became a different kind of object in the office. Before that, there might be just a few staplers around the office. When you needed to staple a document, you went over to the stapler the way at one point you went over to a photocopier. But now it became much more practical for every employee to have a stapler at his or her desk. And not only that, of course, but the more staplers there were, the more things that people found to staple, and the more staples could be sold by Swingline. There's a parallel between the history of the Schrader valve and the Swingline stapler, and that is that just as the rise of bicycling and motoring multiplied the number of valves that were being sold, so the invention of the photocopier in 1960, which was the year of the introduction of the Xerox 914, changed the nature of office work. Now, a copy could look as attractive as an original. People were now making many more copies than anybody expected them to make because they could and because they were distributing documents to more people. Well, every time you made a document with more than one sheet, you needed a staple. So the income of Swingline increased accordingly. This was, of course, very good news for the Linskys. And through years of Depression-era entrepreneurship, they became excellent business people and also very avid art collectors. In fact, some of the greatest art collectors in the world, it is said that they, on occasion, outbid the Queen of England for prized antiques. You can visit their collection today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Their will spelled out very clearly that everything had to remain on display exactly as they had given it. And their taste was really exceptional. Some of the most gorgeous objects produced in the 18th century, like this Boule commode, are in the Linsky collection. And I urge you, if you haven't seen the Linsky rooms in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to save time for them on your next visit. It's a mistake to think that the principles of unimportance no longer apply in the age of the internet and software. To the contrary, they still exist, but just in different form. One of the best examples of this is the MP3 audio format, which is the property of a German research institute, the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft, one of the largest and greatest research organizations in the world. And one of the forces that has made the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft so successful was its development of the MP3 format beginning in 1987, long before the web as we know it. Here is a portrait of the inventors. MP3 has been one of the most culturally influential inventions of all time, in the sense that it has actually changed the musical habits and listening tastes of a whole generation. Academics who study the perception of music find that many younger listeners actually prefer the sound of MP3 to the kind of high fidelity that the previous generation went to such great lengths to achieve. The MP3 format was estimated at one point at giving the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft $100 million a year in revenue. I don't have the current figures, but we can assume that it's still a substantial amount. And this makes the MP3 format the perfect unimportant technology. When I say the perfect unimportant technology, I mean that it is a cost that is paid by millions or billions of consumers, and yet a cost so small for them that they never notice it, that it's below their threshold of perception. And yet, in the aggregate, this unimportant technology is what makes possible some extremely important research. Of course, it's not so easy to identify the unimportant technologies that will ultimately become transformative. The great majority of them fail, and that is why there are no mutual funds for unimportant technology. However, we can learn a lot from the sweep of great unimportant technologies from the early Industrial Revolution to the present, and that is that we may be concentrating too much on what the crowd believes are the great developments of the future. If we exercise our imagination, if we look at the critical contribution that many apparently minor innovations can make, we might have a better rounded view of how successful innovation happens.